From the 2019 Ohioana Book Festival, I'm Doug Dangler with Craft, and I am talking to author Don Tassone, who is the author of the novel Drive and the collections Get Back, 12 short stories, and Small Bites, 40 short stories. So welcome to Craft.
Thank you, Doug. Good to be here.
So tell me about your featured book, Small Bites. You've got 40 short stories in this, and that's why they're small bites, I'm assuming.
Right, yes,
Okay.
Exactly.
So tell me about writing that and some of the topics you cover.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who love to read, but I also know a lot of busy people. And so this was a collection of short stories that I crafted for busy people. Most of the stories are very short. They can be read in about a minute. The longer ones might take a half an hour. And somewhere along the line, the culinary theme emerged. And so I've divided these stories into 3 sections: appetizers, entrees, and desserts, with the entrees being in the middle, and the longer, more nourishing stories, if you will. And designed it so that this is a book you could pick up and read for a moment if you'd like, or make a meal of if you'd like. And the topics are very eclectic, very varied topics, such that I hope it's a good read for people with any appetite, any taste, and that's the concept.
All right. So how, with that many stories, I'm assuming it was spread out over a while.
Yes.
That you were writing it. How long did it take to bring them all together and discover that theme?
Yeah, it took probably about a year to pull this together and write those stories and select the right stories for this collection, and also take the stories out that didn't fit so well. When I initially wrote it, I had 30 stories in mind. When I put 30 together, it just seemed a little bit too thin. So I ended up adding 10 additional stories to kind of add some heft, add some meat to it. And that whole process took about a year.
Okay. So tell me, like, what's a day of writing like for you, especially when you're doing these shorter stories?
Right.
What is that like for you?
Good question. I tend to write in the morning. And a good day of writing for me probably is about 3 hours worth of writing, if I'm so lucky. I also I find myself alternating between short form and longer form writing. So I ended up writing many days, 2 different types of things. And I heard a talk by the great writer Ray Bradbury some years ago, who talked about the importance of writing short stories before writing a novel. And he called the short stories training wheels, for authors, that we cut our teeth on these short stories, and then finally we earn our way into writing a longer form piece of writing, a novel. And I have written 1 novel, and what I find is I find myself, with all due respect to Mr. Bradbury, kind of writing on 2 parallel tracks, short form and long form, and one seems to kind of feed the other. So the short form stories, the short stories, including very short flash fiction stories that may be 100 words, keep me sharp. To tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end in 100 words is quite a challenge. And the longer form writing, which is much more free-flowing but also requires some structure, is a harder piece of writing. And so I find myself doing a little bit of both. Not every day, but on my best days, I'm doing a little bit of both.
It's interesting because I can't remember which author said this, but there's also the view that short stories are harder because you have to pare down all the unnecessary stuff that you can sort of go on about in a novel, whereas that's not the case in short stories. So when you do sit down, you've got the 3 hours. Do you start off by saying, I just have this idea, this kernel of an idea, I'm going to flesh it out, and then pare away? How do you approach your stories in terms of, this is what I want to get done? Because I'm kind of guessing that you're a goal-oriented person, and you say, by the end of today, this is where I want to be.
I am, which can work against me sometimes.
In what way?
Well, I think sometimes writing doesn't lend itself to such neat goals. I think it's much more of a free-flowing process when we're at our best. I read a book some years ago, a very famous book written 30 years ago by a writer named Natalie Goldberg.
Oh, yeah.
And she's a writing guru, and she's a great writer herself, but a great writing instructor. And she's out in New Mexico. And the book was called Writing Down the Bones, and it's kind of a primer on writing, and she's built in a lot of Zen philosophy and so forth along in the process. Which fits because her point in the book is that writing needs to become a regimen in order to become something serious, right? And so we can't just be playing around. We have to actually dive into it At the same time, her advice is to not worry so much about form. So don't worry when you're writing whether what you're writing is going to turn into a poem or a short story or a novel or a screenplay, whatever it is, just write. And eventually that will take care of itself. And so I do enter the writing process typically with an idea, with a core idea, and those ideas for me, for most of my short stories, are a combination of something happening in my life or that's happening in the world, something real that's happening, and some larger idea. And so in this collection, for example, I have a story called Awe, as simple as that. It's about 100 words, very short. And it came out of two things. One is an experience that I had in Cambodia some years ago, watching the sunrise behind the spires of an ancient temple there called Angkor Wat, one of the 7 wonders of the world, with about hundreds of other people at sunrise. And a challenge to myself to write a story about one word that crosses all cultures, all religions, all language, and that word is awe. So that's how that story was born. That's how most of my stories kind of come to be. But to your earlier point, I think then paring that story back is really where the time comes in. So it's easy in a way to write, to kind of free flow write 1,000-word story. It's much harder to pare that back to 100 words.
So with Awe, for example, what was the first draft like? I mean, can you go, was it 300 words, 1,000 words? How much did you get to pare back?
I would say it was at least 300 words. And the famous quote from Mark Twain comes to mind: I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. And so paring anything back, period, is where the real work is. Hemingway said all writing is really rewriting. And I think that's been very much my experience.
Okay. So tell me about the novel Drive. How did that work out for you? You probably didn't have to pare back as much because you have greater freedom in a novel, but what was the experience like?
Yeah, good question. My challenge there was a little bit the opposite, which is how to make it even longer. I had originally written or drafted an outline for that novel, my first ever, which called for about 25 chapters. Ended up writing a story that was a book that was 46 chapters long, almost twice as long. I didn't go into it with that intention, so I ended up writing the outline and ultimately kind of scrapping it, just writing the story. The story is about a man named Nick Reynolds, who is a very successful senior executive for a food company in Chicago. And he is a very successful guy, but he's also a jerk. And he beats up his employees. He's harsh with them. He's estranged from his wife. He doesn't have any friends left. He's burned out. And his boss takes him aside one day after a really particularly tough meeting with his employees and tells him to get his act together or else, and suggests that he take a sabbatical for the summer and get his life sorted out. He does that. He's angry. He decides to drive to a place he's not been before, which is, in this case, Bar Harbor, Maine. And so he drives from Chicago to Maine, halfway across the country. And the story, Drive, is about what happens along the way, his experience, the choices he makes and why he makes those choices, how he changes, what he learns along the way. And I don't want to give the end of the story away, but I wrote the book, which is really about a guy who's a composite of many men I knew in my own career, hundreds of men who were really good business people, but really terribly burned out and in some cases very lost, and they were a mess. And as I've gone through the process of writing now a few books and looking at kind of what's selling, what's the market like for books these days, I've noticed a real gap when it comes to a book like this, a book geared to men, period, but also to those who are their loved ones and who care about them. So I wrote this book for them, basically, to kind of give them voice and give them a sense of hope.
Okay. All right, well, Don Tassone, thank you very much for talking with me today. And the books, again, are the novel Drive and the collections Get Back, 12 short stories, and Small Bites, 40 short stories. So thanks much.
Thank you.